try a few thoughts in addition to that old prayer. The one thing I want to start out with is that whole prayer talks about sort of a focus on the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. And I don't know about you, but growing up, I did not grow up in a Pentecostal tradition, so I am talking about a non-expert view of this, but I've found in Pentecostal voices some very helpful concepts that actually tie into a bunch of older concepts that run through Christianity that I feel like I didn't get enough of. And so this is my way of saying I found these things helpful, and I want to bring them to you. One of the voices I found helpful is Dr. Amos Young from Fuller, and he has this quote, and this is the quote that I took the title of my talk from. Okay, but when understood in faith from the redemptive eschatological perspective of final theological causation, the story of the creation of the world comes alive with the breath of the Spirit of God, even as the many tongues of the various scientific disciplines can be seen to illuminate different facets of the Creator's artistic work. It's a mouthful. It's got a lot of words that he explains in the rest of the book. And what jumped out to me is the many tongues of the various scientific disciplines. I am a biochemist, and so I always have one foot in chemistry and one foot in biology at the very least. And that also means you have a foot in physics, a foot in math, a foot in sociology even, or psychology and neurology if you're talking about how the human brain functions. And so I see these many tongues of the various scientific disciplines. This is kind of where I'm at. And so to see a theologian saying if we look at the world as being sort of drenched with the Spirit of God, we start to see these tongues speak together in the language that is most natural to us. And so I want to talk about some of those things. Now, I didn't know Amos until I met him, and so he's kind of a friend of mine. So full disclosure, you know, I'm mentioning his voice because he's part of a program called BioLogos Voices, and I'm part of that program too. You can see that Amos is under Bible and Theology, and I am here under Physical Sciences. I'm actually playing with Legos down here, but I think they cropped that off because they were worried that they might have copyright infringement or something. I don't know. But the whole point about BioLogos Voices, has anybody heard of the BioLogos program? Do you know what I'm talking about? What it is it's a bunch of scholars that took, it's a bunch of scientists in the evangelical church who have sort of banded together, and we got a grant to help us out, to talk about how science and faith are not as at odds the same way that they seem to be popularly portrayed. Specifically, this means that a lot of us are talking about how evolution can be understood as part of creation. And so the BioLogos Voices is actually supposed to be a bunch of people who go out to the church and talk to the church about why could I say this? Why do I think this is so? What does it mean to say that this could be part of it? The harmony between science and faith is in sort of the mission system, the mission statement right here. So our purpose is sort of outgoing, outward looking at the church and talking to the church. But when I got to this workshop, I met all these people, and I'm like, these people are really cool. They have some cool ideas, especially Amos. You know, he's cool enough to wear a bow tie right there. And the thing about Amos is I was like, I didn't know that you could be a Pentecostal and basically be talking about how evolution and faith go together. Isn't that kind of non-Pentecostal of you? But it's very deep Pentecostal for him. And so I wanted to start to think about how he puts things together. And I realized as I did this that this prompted my own thinking. You know, and so this was sort of an inward result of the BioLogos Voices program. When David Brooks published this a couple weeks ago, it reminded me of what's going on in my own head as I'm going through these issues, because I don't have it all figured out, you know, but actually being around these other scholars has prompted my own thinking on this. And, you know, when we're talking about BioLogos, we're talking about persuasion. We're talking about saying we are scientists. You've heard that science and faith are at loggerheads on this particular issue, but we don't think that's true. We're trying to persuade you. And so I was thinking about how you persuade people. David Brooks had a quote that sort of made my ears perk up. Do you persuade people by writing thoughtful essays that carefully marshal facts like you might be doing for a class right now? Well, actually that kind of works some of the time, and that's what David Brooks does for a living. But this really stood out. The real way to persuade people is to create an attractive community that people want to join. If you do that, they'll bend their opinions to yours. If you want people to be reasonable, create groups where it's cool to be reasonable. And so I sort of feel like maybe we're trying to make reasonable cool again or something like that. But it realizes that I want people to experience God, to know all three persons of the Trinity. And I think our community would do well to listen to all the voices that emphasize the different aspects of the God who is too great for us to fully comprehend, and that we always understand in part. So the thing that I want to start with is I want to start with some data. And the data is a Gallup poll, probably the most prestigious long-term poll. And they've asked a question since 1981 about how did human beings originate. Most people, the number of people responding, God guided the process. There's three options, and I'll show you those in a second. But the God guided the process is like what Biologos wants to say. God guided the process included evolution. The number rose sharply since the previous poll in 2014 in the space of 3 years. For the first time, equal numbers of people answered God guided as answered God created humans in their present form, which implies a young earth. So that will be called the young earth response. If humans were created in their present form, it doesn't make sense that that form was around for 4 billion years. So it goes along with a young earth as opposed to a billions-year-old earth, which goes along with a development view. Now, Deb, the president of Biologos and an astronomer, do you notice she was actually next to me in the physical sciences there? She wrote this on the blog, significant gains for Biologos view. Yeah, she's president of Biologos, so she's going to say, yay, this looks like more people are being persuaded by our group, right? While loud voices continue to push extreme positions on origins, either anti-science or anti-God, this study shows that many everyday Americans are open to a conversation that brings science and God together, which is the conversation that Biologos wants to promote. And so this is the way the Gallup poll did this, and you can analyze sort of the difference, in U.S. belief in creationist view of humans at new low. That seems a little bit more depressing than the way that Deborah put it. And here's the actual data as put by Biologos. Here's the actual question. They ask, which of your following statements comes closest to your views? 1, human beings developed over millions of years, but God guided this process, light green line. 2, human beings developed over millions of years, but God had no part in this process, dark green line at the bottom. 3, God created man in his present form, and that is the gray line. And what we're talking about is the difference, and if you look all the way over here, the first time that the green line and the gray line are meeting is right here in the 2017. Let me show you the next slide, and then I'll ask you a little bit more. So, what's that missing? Error bars. Okay, we need error bars, and obviously the data is jumping around a little bit. It's poll data. Poll data it's the most reliable poll, but still it's going to have error bars. So here's a scientist from the Jesus Creed blog who goes by RJS to have some kind of anonymity. It's interesting that scientists still need some kind of anonymity, but this is not anonymity from the church. This is anonymity from other scientists, but that's another story in itself. Okay, but RJS, a scientist who is a Christian, and put all the data in. So I really like this, and I think you'd say this looks like a significant change. I mean, you've had the lines bouncing up and down before, and they almost came together before. But this really does look like it's unprecedented in the history of the poll. Although also notice, opinions aren't changing very quickly. Of course they don't. They don't really change that quickly on big issues like this. So that's what I see when I look at the data, but there's another couple of things that you might see when you look at the data. So I want to ask you, what do you notice when you look at the data? Any comments? Anything you want to highlight? Yeah. Yeah, the rise in the red line is, as a percentage point, it's doubled, right? So that's a good observation. I have a slide about that, so thank you for introducing that. But so yeah, that's one thing that definitely jumped out to me. Is there anything else that you notice? Yeah. Yeah.
Is that just the amount of people decided to believe God had influence like some influence?
I think it's this plus this. Yeah, I think it's the two lines, and it might include the other answer or not. Although that's such a small percentage that I'm really not sure if that includes it. It definitely does not include the no guidance, because that's the one that I know that they must have excluded. And it mirrors the rise of the no guidance, so that goes with what we observed. Actually, she didn't publish her methodology. By the way, I think RJS is a she, and she didn't publish her methodology, so I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, those method sections are important, right? Any other comments or observations that you, or questions about this? What do you think?
I have a question about the poll itself.
Okay.
What were the means of answering to it, like phones or text messaging or face-to-face? What was the audience size? Was it only a state, the entire United States, or is it every Christian person in the world? Like, how are they doing this poll?
This is as broad of a poll as possible. Now, I don't know if how they've changed their methods, but they have calibrated for how they've changed their methods. And compared to other polls, like you'll see, it is the gold standard for polls. Kind of the Gallup poll is, they make their money off being the best poll out there. It's also, they try to keep things constant from 1982 till the present. But obviously things have changed and polling has changed itself. And actually this is a really interesting topic. I just want to put in a little thing. There's a blog called 538 by a guy named Nate Silver. And if you want to know about how polling works, follow him. And he will give you real insights onto how the stuff works. And so with that said, I'm pretty sure Nate Silver would say Gallup poll is the best of the polls and more methodological details. I'd be interested to know how they do that, but they do try to do that. So that's what I can say for sure. What do you think?
It seems the God-guided and in-present form lines are kind of rising and decreasing at the same rate. So it's probably the same group, but switching over.
Yeah, so you can talk about how you can, I mean, you can't be sure until you look at the data, right? But it looks like there might be some switching between groups. The rise here is greater than the rise here. And actually, this stays flat for this poll period, although error bars, you can't tell. So welcome to science. We have error bars and everything, and it's always hard to tell for sure. But it looks like this is real. That's the thing I want to, at least to me, it passes the sniff test, okay? The data is broken down like this, and here is a, by the way, this is God-guided, this is no part, and this is present form. So this is young Earth creationist. RJS also put this in a bar graph, so I like the bar graph more. I'm just going to throw this up. This data is probably interesting to break it down. Is there anything that you notice in looking at this data? This is education going up, and so God-guided, not guided, and young Earth creationists are in the same order as they are for these. So I don't know if you see anything in the data. There's a couple of things that we might pull out of it. What do you want to pull out of that data? What can you conclude?
So it seems that the God-guided and there's no guidance bars go up as far as education goes up, while young Earth ones goes drastically down as higher education is used.
Okay, so we have a divide among education as you go more. Now, doesn't say anything about the source of that divide, but there are many other things that trend along education as well. Again, Nate Silver's blog, really interesting stuff there. But yeah, there's a definite trend, and both of these, you sort of go up. Most of the people, and that's the other thing I want to make clear about this. This was trying to get as representative a sample of Americans as possible. So it's all kinds of Americans, and not just those who even believe in God. And you'll notice, the other thing I want to notice is how low the not guided level is. People are willing to say that God was there and is active in some way. There's still like a 4-to-1 ratio of people who are saying that God is somehow active and present in the process. And I think that's important. You know, it's for all the trend of the one-line doubling, it's gone from 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 of people saying that God had no part in the process. And so, yeah, but we need to keep an eye on that part because it actually has a disproportionate level of voicing in certain areas. There's certain places where if you read it, it seems like the number should be 100% from the way people are talking, that rather than 20%. So I have to throw in a little voice from a Russian here, Dostoevsky. Apparently that's the Russian. I'm going to trust the internet on that one, but I'm going to also trust the internet on the translation here because it comes from somebody I trust. And I just want to point out that the God had no part line, that's not even necessarily an atheist line. It's just saying that God had no part in the creation. You'll notice that actually some of the religious breakdown had some people who go to church answering God had no part. But I want to say that it really is a statement of deism. It doesn't say whether there's a God or not, but it's saying that God does not interact with God's creation. And Dostoevsky had some words to say about this, so he would speak to that line. He would say that they are the materialists, not in the sense of the people who go to the mall all the time, but the people who think that there is nothing but material. Universal inertia and the mechanization of matter, that teaching amounts to death. The teaching of the true philosophy is the annihilation of inertia. It is thought. It is the center and synthesis of the universe and its external form, matter. It is God. It is eternal life. I would not be surprised to see that some of these terms are also associated in the Russian language with the activity of the Spirit, of God's Spirit, because you have this very active sort of idea. And so Dostoevsky is saying, yeah, it's good that we have 80% of the people who Dostoevsky is not teaching to here. And there is I do want to say, don't assume deism by default when you're reading something about science or something like that. It's more that more people believe that God is near than that God is far. And this comes out in our worship songs. So here's some evangelical worship songs. I go to a non-denominational evangelical church, and so I've been involved with the music there for many years, for like 20 years in Seattle. And so I've seen a bunch of songs come by that when I see a song come by that mentions science that's newly written, I sort of perk up. You know, I'm a scientist. I think that's cool. And so let me show you a little bit of a progression. Here's a song called God of Wonders. Does anybody recognize this song? Okay, so y'all, it's now 17 years old, which kind of makes me feel really old. I remember when this was I've liked this this is Steve Hindalong. I've liked his music since I was in high school. That tells you that he's really old now. But it's, the thing I liked about this is God of Wonders beyond our galaxy, you are holy, holy. I think that's the first time I remember hearing galaxy in a newly written word, in a hymn at all. You have some nature words in old hymns, but galaxy, I don't remember it being in a hymn book, and definitely wasn't emphasized in my Southern Baptist upbringing. The beautiful things, you probably know this one. I think we've sung this one relatively recently in chapel and things like that. And so the thing I like about this, you make beautiful things out of the dust. This is a process that seems like a process that God is guiding, right? But it's using biblical words. It's using the word of dust from Genesis 2. And it's talking about God continuing God's creation in making beautiful things, making us new as we're singing. And so it's connecting biological growth. And, you know, chemistry is about dust. You know, chemistry is about small particles influencing and being built up into bigger things, into beautiful things. And so I think of this as a chemistry song. I'm a little biased, okay? So, has anybody heard this song? So Will I, 100 Billion X. Have they sung it in a church that you know? Okay. So I don't know if they've sung it in my church yet. I go to Bethany Community Church. I know the worship director knows this song and likes this song. He thinks it might be too many words for us, but I also wonder if he's worried about the content of the words. So I'm just going to put this up here. For those of you who have sung it, you might be familiar with the words. Those of you who haven't sung it, just look over the words briefly and tell me things you notice about how this looks at nature. How does this describe nature? What do you notice? And it could be a way of describing nature that's age-old, or it could be a new way of describing nature. There's something that really stands out to people that I think gives worship directors a little bit of pause in singing this. And honestly, it could cause division that is needless in the church. What do you notice about the lyrics here? What do you think?
Well, I mean, he says, you have spoken all nature and science fall the sound of your voice, and he also mentions evolving somewhere.
There, that's the big word. Kind of buried in there, you know. Yeah, you might flip right by it, but that's what everyone notices. You know, they should have called it the Evolving Song. I don't know. It'd be easier to remember. I can't remember this title. So anyways, did you have a comment along those lines? Yeah.
It was when I got to evolving.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what your reaction was, but I mean, we have a big non-denominational church, and one of the disadvantages of that is sometimes you don't have a denominational structure to fall back on and say, hey, the structure said this is okay. And that means that we actually might be a little bit harder for us to introduce this to a large group because this might make some people angry. It might sound like we're saying God had no part in the process. Great are you, Lord, you had no part in the process. Doesn't make any sense, right? Yeah, anything else that you notice? I think there could be some interesting, I don't know if somebody has some like textual analysis or something like that, so ideas of something else you notice about the song.
Earlier, he is talking about how galaxies are born with the breath the planets form.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, vapor, planets forming, galaxies are born, 100 billion kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
Makes the universe seem a lot larger than traditional thought had made the universe out to be. And it also seems very indirectly to be referencing creation through science, standard thinking of Big Bang Theory kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And that planets and stars basically formed out of a bunch of gaseous particles floating around in space.
Right. So, and gas, by the way, comes from the word chaos. Chaos and gas. In Dutch, chaos is like gas something. I forget what it is in Dutch. But you notice that gas and chaos are similar? That's for a reason. And it's actually talking about forming order out of chaos. What do you see?
I like when you're talking about the whole textual analysis thing,
Mhm.
because a lot of when you are looking at concepts like related to the Holy Spirit, it talks about a lot about breath. It's like when you breathe life into something.
Right.
Like, I can't think like the exact scriptures, but I do a lot of studying. So
Yeah, I can't remember either, but it's on a later slide. Yeah.
It always says like, the vapor of your breath. So whenever you hear breath, it's only the breath of the Holy Spirit or the breath of God, and you breathe into them and there's life. So
Mhm.
it's has sort of those things in there, but I thought it was interesting how you're talking about the science versus faith as well, because it seems more like the Big Bang sort of
Yeah.
idea,
Yeah.
which is like kind of complex when you start implanting that into the Christian community, because they don't know how to react to that, and they react in different ways. So
Yeah.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah. What did Jesus do in John's account after the resurrection? Jesus said, receive the Holy Spirit. And what did he do after that? Or it might be right before. He breathed on the disciples. It's a direct reference to breathing and creating in that creation event. So we can start to draw parallels. Creation event of the Big Bang, creation event of life, biology, astronomy, / physics, astrophysics, and then after the creation. So we can start to draw these, and I think this is really nice because it's not just shoehorned in. It's not just like galaxies. I was kind of wondering, oh, you just wanted to use the word galaxy, you know? I mean, you're talking about how great God is, and I think it really works. But I think that from the 2001, that was a big step for the time, possibly, just to use a modern word like galaxy and trust that wouldn't throw people off. This is using modern concepts. And it's also bringing it to us. So will I. And that's what they're emphasizing with this, the size of the universe, but also the personal response at the end. Here's another worship song, a little bit older. Okay, Psalm 104. But Amos did a devotion, Dr. Young did a devotion at the workshop based on this. And I thought to myself, this is really Pentecostal. So I have a few things that I want to point out about how the different disciplines that I see here, but I sort of just want to read a few things and just ask you what you might see in this song. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, thou art very great. I'm going to skip down to here. Who maketh the clouds his chariot, who walketh upon the wings of the wind, who maketh his angels spirit and his ministers a flaming fire. You've got angels, you've got wind moving, you've got flaming fire, lots of spirit level metaphors here. O Lord, how manifold are thy works, in wisdom thou hast made them all. The earth is full of thy riches, so is this great and wide sea, wherein are things creeping innumerable, both small and great beasts. There go the ships. There is that Leviathan whom thou hast made to play therein. They all wait upon thee, that thou mayest give them their meat in due season. Thou givest them, they gather. Thou openest thine hand, they are filled with good. Thou hidest thy face, they are troubled. Thou takest away their breath, they die and return to their dust. Thou sendest forth thy spirit, they are created, and thou renewest the face of the earth. I want you to see how many of these spirit metaphors, and many of the same metaphors that we saw in that last song, are also right here. You see the Spirit moving in creation and creating. So that's what I see in it. And I see another couple of scientific disciplines and things like that. Actually, a number of different areas of the world are shown in this. Do you have any comments or thoughts looking at this in light of the other songs? In light of the question of how does God guide the process? What do you think?
I think that it's a lot of the same thing, just without the scientific knowledge words, where
Okay.
we look at the 100 billion galaxies and we're like, oh, that's a fact, they'll put that in their songs. They couldn't have known that. They didn't have a way of seeing those.
Right.
But it's saying the same thing.
Yeah, thou art very great. You just quantify it with 100 million. You know, they might not have even had that word, right?
And as they saw that he had created the world glorified him,
Mhm.
so that they must glorify him. That's the same kind of worship as the so will I.
Right. So it even has a statement, the so will I statement. It moves through creation, and it says, so will I. Yeah. What do you see?
I agree. I mean, I think what's interesting about this one is that, as opposed to the first song, there's more like Leviathan, or like you have textual references, but at the same time, in the older song, or not older song, sorry, the newer one,
Yeah.
they
Old.
they also make those references and mix it with modern concepts.
Mhm.
So, yeah, a mix of both.
Yeah, it's sort of an act of translation, and how far do you get before you have a new word, really? But you do have similar concepts, and all of these things they saw happening bit by bit. So the one thing is, thou givest them their food, their meat in due season. That's not saying that poof, all of a sudden the meat appears. That's not how God's giving. God's giving through a natural process. For pretty much all these things they can see, and they're saying, God, you are working through that natural process. You are giving them their meat. When one of them eats the other, even, you are giving the lion its meat. There are some verses like that in the psalm. So the thing about this is this does talk about a world ordered by God, but a world in which God is supplying the order through, at least in some parts, through natural processes, and giving him the credit for that. It has a description of the water cycle in the first part of the psalm that I skipped over. That was something that people could observe and people knew, and they said, God, you are working through that. So this is the idea of wisdom literature, okay? By wisdom the Lord founded the earth. By his understanding he established the heavens. How great are your works, O Lord. Deep indeed are your plans. They are deep. You have to think about them. And sometimes you have to uncover the things that God sort of hid. And I like this quote. In modern times, we think of the world's rules as autonomous. There just is something called gravity, or the first law of thermodynamics. But in the biblical world of God's presence, it was God who established, and I'm going to add, and hid the rules. Some of the rules are obvious, but some of the rules are hidden. And the thing is, to me, science has uncovered how well established and how powerful the rules really are and how we can understand them. That doesn't necessarily mean that God is not over and above and breathing through them in a way. So this is the thing I sort of grew up with an idea that God is sort of it emphasized God's transcendence, which is true. But God's transcendence is also balanced with God's immanence. And so this is what transcendence looks like. If you emphasize God's transcendence, you say that God was outside the cosmos, and the cosmos is here like a clock operating on its own, and God sometimes comes in and like pokes his finger in there or something like that, right? And this is both creationism and deism. When you say that God is frequently reaching in and sort of violating his own rules. But that's actually a relatively new way of looking at God. It's come by a way of focusing on the cosmos so much and seeing these law-like regularities. But classical theism, if you go back to Thomas Aquinas, you see a picture that looks like this. God is unconditioned reality. The cosmos is conditioned reality. God continuously creates, sustains, and gives existence to the cosmos. God is closer than the atoms are. He is closer to us than we are to ourselves. Augustine actually says something like this. So this is actually an older view than this is. This is the modern view. And so if we're talking about old versus new, I think we should listen to Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and things like that. And we should rebalance God's immanence. Now, this old Catholicism, this Thomas Aquinas type thinking, also goes along with Pentecostalism that sees the Spirit as being God's aspect that does these verbs, creates, sustains, and gives existence to. And that means that God is very close, okay? And so Dr. Young says this. He says Pentecostal believers, along with other Christians, would simply make the opposite assumption. It is the existence and activity of God that sustain the laws of nature, rather than the other way around, assuming that the laws are somehow out there and God is under them. God is the lawgiver. There's another philosopher named Peirce who says the laws of nature are really useful things, but they really aren't laws in the sense of, they're laws for us, like we can't violate them, but they're really more habits. He liked to use the word habits rather than laws. And I think that's an interesting thing. It also helps when in the lab, when you're trying to go by a law of nature and just everything messes up. Then you can just say, well, you know, it's the habit of the universe to do that, but in this particular experiment, the habit didn't work, you know. The laws are actually working at a deeper level than that, but it is a little bit of a comfort when things don't go well. So there's lots of metaphors for God's hidden immanence. This is one that I think is really helpful, and it's from a Catholic writer. God envelops us so thoroughly that we almost have good reason to think that he does not exist. And in fact, he does not exist in the same way as creatures do. That's Aquinas. The fetus does not see his mother. And if he can think that he has no mother, it is just because everything is a sign of her presence. Because she is present everywhere, and not only somewhere inside her belly where the fetus is. That's a very interesting metaphor, but it's a metaphor of God's immanence. That's the kind of, goes with that figure that we had. And there's also, so the metaphor of a fetus in a womb is sort of a liquid metaphor. There's a number of other liquid metaphors that are used for the Spirit that I've picked up. The Holy Spirit is the force in the straining muscles of an arm, the film of sweat between pressed cheeks, the mingled wetness on the backs of clasped hands. He is as close and unobtrusive as that, and irresistibly strong. This is not to say that the metaphor contains the Spirit, but the other way around. The Spirit includes in some way these characteristics that are also in the metaphor. And this is, by the way, in Paul Brand, who is in evangelical circles, he's almost a saint if evangelicals had saints. So this isn't some out there person from evangelicalism. This is quoted in one of the main texts of evangelicalism. And then there's this. This is actually a poem that is a song by a band called Over the Rhine. You know, I can't even begin to see your eyes, but if I'm ever really drunk, it will be from drinking every drop of your soul and running till I sweat your spirit. This idea of incorporation and the liquid metaphor, very close to us. It also shows up in chemistry, and even how we should we teach chemistry? Should we teach chemistry as a bunch of rocks that run into each other and happen to do this cool stuff? Or should we talk about it as a process? And the way that this chemist talks about it says we should teach chemistry as a process, and the best process to illustrate chemistry is a flame, one of the foundational Pentecostal metaphors. So I just want to say this, that you know, we need a new idea of nature, is what he says, a different basic attitude toward how the world works. To oversimplify, we need to move from a substance-based rock metaphors to process-centered flame ways of thought. So a flame and flowing water are both processes more than they are, you know, they include atoms, but the essential thing you need to explain is you need to explain the process to explain how they work. And by the way, I just found out that this guy is also Catholic. They're everywhere. Okay, so I wrote this about Pentecostal view, and then I found all these spirit metaphors that were coming from other viewpoints as well. So I want to end up telling you a little bit about Young's Pentecostal theology of nature. It's multidisciplinary, and I'm going to quote a lot from his book, The Spirit of Creation. He's basically saying that the many Pentecostal tongues can be understood analogically as providing a theological rationale for the many scientific disciplines. Just like there were many languages on the day of Pentecost, and each person understood them speaking in his language, you can think of the biologist hearing God's voice in biology, or hearing the voice of God's Spirit in their particular discipline. And so it's multidisciplinary, and it comes from biology, geology, chemistry, all that stuff. And it's also relational. It's not about it's about the relationship between things rather than a thing in itself. Given the sensitivity of such chaotic systems to initial conditions, and given especially the vulnerability, openness, and interrelatedness of such dissipative systems. And he's talking about organisms as dissipative systems that are vulnerable, open, and interrelated. And we're interrelated with our environment. You all need the air that's coming through right now. You need the breath in your lungs to continue to be alive. And so we're all interacting with our environment, and I think it's a mistake to sort of count out that variable too much. So multidisciplinary and relational is what Young's Pentecostal theology gives us. So, and this is also not really a new idea. This is from Irenaeus. I don't even know how to say it. Irenaeus? Anybody want to correct me? Heard the theology professor say it? So basically from the 100s AD, this Christian suggests that God's Son and the Holy Spirit are the two arms of God in nature. He goes on to say that the Son structures and the Spirit guides creation. There's that word that we're wondering about. How can we talk about how God guides creation? Well, I think we should look at the Spirit and consider that the Spirit works in this kind of way with these kind of metaphors. One of the ideas here is the breath metaphor that comes. This is Dr. Young, and he's saying that rabbis have for a long time understood the Spirit as the element of creative fire, the divine intellect that gives form to matter, the Ruach Elohim. And it restrains and reshapes the primeval chaos. The chaos is neither a messy something or other nor a literal void. So the idea of the Spirit providing shape to the natural history, to the world. The flame, a flickering flame, retains sort of the same shape, even though atoms are passing into and out of it. And so it's kind of saying that life is like that flame, and the process is like what the Spirit enables and empowers and encourages that process. And so you see this in Genesis. This is how Pentecostal interprets Genesis 1, pointing out that sometimes God says, let there be, and there is. Sometimes God says, let there be, and what there is develops from something that is already there. You have both kinds of language. And so he's pointing out that God creates and makes by saying, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees that bear fruit. And by the way, this is what you get when you do a Google search image for bear fruit. There's a bear, there's fruit. So it doesn't always work. But he's saying, now it's careful not to blur the creator-creature distinction. The main point of the creation account is that the creator is distinct from creation. At the same time, it is also the case that God creates by calling forth the order of creation as co-creators and enabling the various levels of creation. By the way, just a little side note, J.R.R. Tolkien took a co-creational attitude to how he wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And I have a lot more, I'll have a whole nother lecture about that. But the same idea that God allows us to co-create with God is crucial to this, and you can find it in Genesis 1. Here's the thing about the breath of God. Just notice that in Genesis 1 and 2, you don't have just one kind of image. You have transcendent and immanent images. You have the Spirit hovering over at the very beginning of creation. You have the Spirit as the breath in creation. So the Ruach Elohim, the breath of God, is hovering over or moving upon the primordial chaos. That's transcendental. But later in Genesis 2, you had the breath of life given to an operative in creatures and ha-adam. So the Ruach Elohim is present and at work within the creaturely domain. You have both kinds of language. And so the idea of the breath of God, it's not saying that the images of the breath of God are complete by themselves, but that there's this, we need both kinds of images. And the God as giving us breath, we have to hold these two aspects of design, practice, and activity together, regardless of how we are tempted to privilege one or the other. Growing up, I was taught even to privilege the transcendent, and now I'm trying to learn how to talk more about the immanent. Okay. So I went to audience, one more thing of audience participation. I went to see if you can identify if these are real events, we should be able to talk about when they happened. And there are 4 events, okay, that Young talks about where we can talk about a scientific event that we observed and we can say with faith, I know the Spirit was active here. I don't know necessarily even how the Spirit was active, but I know that the Spirit was active. Each of these events is a sign foreshadowing the redemptive transformation of living creatures in the age to come, a sign pointing to the future, okay? A future of relationship with God. Each act of the Spirit ushers in something novel into the world, supervenes upon former acts, and fulfills and completes them in light of the future-oriented or eschatological intentions of God. So, 4 events. Anybody want to guess what one of them is? What do you think, Jonathan? That's number 4. Great. So yes, and that one is, you see how it ushers in something novel into the world, the resurrected Christ, and now ascended and seated at the right hand of the Father, right? It supervenes upon former acts. It works on the body of Christ. You know, it's Jesus lived, and then he died, and then the resurrection happened. So that's supervening, and then fulfills, completes them in light of the eschatological intentions of God. This is God's intention for humans, the resurrected appearances that we have. So yeah, that definitely fulfills all 4. That's sort of the theological one. The really interesting thing is to bring back and say, how could there be 3 previous events that at least have a scientific component? Theological, historical, resurrection of Christ. What do you think about the parallel events that you could put in there for numbers 1 through 3, if that's number 4? What do you think?
Random guess, but maybe the creation of mankind.
Okay. So the creation of mankind, and actually Yang says that with an important qualifier. That's number 3. So we're going to say, I always thought of it as creation of Adam. He actually qualifies it slightly from that, but yeah, that's basically it. So we've got number 3. So we work our way back. Okay, for creatures to have creatures who can respond to God and have a relationship with God. Resurrection, creation of mind, creation of humans. And what do you need to have for creation of humans? Creation of what?
Creation of the world.
Of the world, and specifically, I guess that actually applies to both of the previous 2, depending on whether you're a physicist or a biologist. So which would you choose? If I said blue pill, red pill, physicist or biologist, which one would you?
Biologist.
Okay. And really, I'd be perfectly fine for you to say both biochemistry, okay? So, but biologists, so the creation, the origin of life on the early earth would fill all these categories. Life is something novel, supervenes upon former acts, and fulfills, completes them, because it creates creatures that are able to respond to their environment while being still connected to their environment. It gives the potential for one of those creatures to think, talk, you know, have a mind. And so we've actually already mentioned the first, if you want to be a physicist, then it'd be the Big Bang, right? And the only thing about the Big Bang, definitely something novel. How does it supervene upon former acts? Well, maybe it's at the beginning, so it doesn't have to fulfill criterion 2. But also, the Big Bang came from a false vacuum. And could the false vacuum be the thing that the chaotic thing that was brought into order by the Spirit? I don't know. I'm not a physicist. So when I talk about physics, I have a friend who's physics, and he kind of is like, I wouldn't use that word that way. And I'm like, okay, I'll let you talk about physics. But we can all be interdisciplinary here. So these are the 4 signs that that Jung puts: the Big Bang, the emergence of life. And so don't be scared of origin of life scenarios. I used to be scared of those. But now I think it's kind of cool. And I think that we actually are converging on a possible way in which chemical rules led to biological life. And in a way that we can understand. Maybe we can understand it, maybe we can't. I'm just not going to say from the beginning that we can't understand any of these, except for the resurrection of Christ. I would say the emergence of God consciousness. Yeah, this is a special, unique intervention kind of event, okay? The election of Adam and Israel. So you notice how this is slightly different than what I automatically say. It's not just about Adam, it's about the creation of Israel. Remember, Israel is also a first name, right? And Israel is a community, a people. And maybe this kind of language could help, because if we're all about how did Adam come into existence, well, it's not exactly the point to dwell too much on Adam, because Adam was leading to Israel. The idea of biology was not to create one person. It's not good for a man to be alone. It's to create a nation that was called out and elected. So I want to combine those two in the idea, and that's really biology going into sociology and psychology, if you want to talk about the interdisciplinary aspect of that. So the point of this is to point to something else, okay? Jung talks about how these are just vague ideas at this moment, but they're kind of promissory note or down payment. Notice that Paul used that kind of language for the Spirit in one of his letters. Basically, the resurrection suggests that the world is open to God's future. And put in Pentecostal terms, salvation is the intended goal for mankind, while conversion, regeneration, sanctification, Spirit baptism, all those churchy words are intensifying experiences toward that end, the end of God's future and the city of God, Revelation 21, the city of God coming down from heaven. Okay. So this is the point where I'm out of time, but I just want to say that Jung actually talks about, if you're like Pentecostal and you're like, well, what about angels? What about Satan? What about all the things that are emphasized in my church? Jung talks about those. He talks about angels, the church, and Satan as real, emergent, personal realities. This is also where people disagree with him more, but it's also where people can disagree. I just want to say he has some interesting stuff worked out. So if you're interested in reading it, also Daniel Costello has a really great book that I just got handed to me by Dr. Wall that is probably easier to read than Dr. Jung's. So I recommend that as well. The main thing is that Christ unmasked the lying, murderous, and violent powers. He broke the cycle of violence by refusing to perpetuate in the cycle of violence. This is a Catholic thinker, René Girard, being quoted by a Pentecostal thinker, Amos Yong, in a footnote that I think shows a lot about what the cross did. And so I got to make sure that we mention all persons of the Trinity here. It's just because we are out of time that I would talk another lecture about the cross. So I just want to say, what is Jung talking about? He's talking about the way God's Spirit guides creation through the many tongues of the various scientific disciplines that is redemptive and eschatological, pointed toward God's future and the fulfillment of God's plans. And with all that, we are out of time. Thank you very much for coming today. And yeah, send me an email or drop by my office if you have questions. I love to talk about this stuff.